I want to tell you about the hour I stopped believing in coincidence. I was in Florence working through a private architectural archive that doesn't advertise its existence, the kind of place that requires a letter of introduction from someone who knows someone, and where the reading room smells like plaster dust and old vellum, and the quiet particular to rooms that have absorbed a century of careful attention. I was going through a collection of restoration documents from the late 19th century. Field notes from the teams who repaired the great churches of Tuscany after Italian unification disrupted the maintenance networks that had sustained them for generations. And there was a section I almost skipped, a series of proportional surveys extracted from the stone itself during restoration work, because no original design documents existed. No plans, no blueprints, no records of architectural intent. Just the building and what the building contained, and the careful measurements of the men who had tried to understand it by touching it. The numbers were remarkable, not because they were elegant, though they were, because they were familiar. I had seen those ratios before, not in another Italian church, not in another European building of any period. I had seen them in a structural survey of a shrine complex in Nikko, Japan, conducted by a Japanese architectural preservation team in the 1970s, and published in a journal I had been working through for unrelated reasons 6 months earlier. I sat with those two documents for a long time. Then I went back through my notes, then further back through years of site visits and archival work across 3 continents that I had not previously understood as constituting a single investigation. Once you start looking for it, you cannot stop finding it. The question isn't whether the geometry is there. The geometry is there. I can take you through it, building by building, ratio by ratio, continent by continent. The question, the one that nobody in the official record has been willing to ask with adequate seriousness, is what the geometry means, what it was for, who understood it, and why that understanding disappeared. Let me start with what we are told, because the official story is not a careless one. It is internally coherent, elegantly organized, and supported by an enormous amount of genuine documentation. Western ecclesiastical architecture, we are taught, developed through a traceable succession. Roman building practice was absorbed and modified by the early Christian church. Romanesque emerged from that fusion. Gothic emerged from Romanesque. The Renaissance recovered classical proportion. The Baroque layered theatrical drama onto Renaissance discipline. Each transition is explained, each has names attached to it: Brunelleschi, Palladio, Wren, Schinkel, and buildings attached to those names, and documents attached to those buildings: contracts, letters, sketchbooks, account books. The story is told in every serious architecture program on Earth, and most of it is true. But there is a problem embedded in the story that only becomes visible when you step entirely outside its own frame of reference. When you stop asking where European architecture came from and start asking why it matches architecture that has no documented connection to Europe. When you stop moving within the tradition and start measuring across traditions. Because it does match, not approximately, not in the way that any two sophisticated building traditions might share general aesthetic principles, in a way that is specific, measurable, and by the standards of the official history, inexplicable. Stand in the nave of Chartres Cathedral, built, we are told, across the 12th and 13th centuries, one of the defining achievements of Gothic architecture. The nave height from floor to vault keystone is 37 metres. The nave width is 16.5 metres. The ratio between them is approximately 2.24 to 1, a number derived from a specific geometric construction, a relationship between the diagonal of a square and its side, applied as the master ratio governing every proportional decision in the building. The placement of windows, the height of the arcade, the thickness of the piers, the pitch of the flying buttresses, all of it generated from a single underlying geometric logic. Now go to Angkor Wat in Cambodia, completed in the 12th century, the same century as Chartres, a Hindu temple complex in a tradition with no documented architectural connection to France, to Europe, to any Western tradition whatsoever. The central sanctuary tower rises 65 metres. The base of the central complex spans 65 metres. one-to-one at the center, scaling outward through a recursive application of the same proportional logic to every subsidiary element and every unit of ornamental detail. The specific numbers differ from Chartres. The principle that generates the numbers does not. When you extract the governing ratios from both structures and place them in the same geometric framework, they relate to each other through transformations too precise to dismiss as philosophical coincidence. I worked through these numbers with a structural engineer who had done restoration work at both sites. She was not interested in my theoretical questions. She was interested in the numbers. At the end of several weeks of calculation, she said something I have not been able to put down. These buildings were designed by people who understood the same thing, not the same religion, not the same culture, not the same century, the same thing. But Chartres and Angkor are famous buildings, well studied and connected by the known channels of medieval trade and cultural exchange. Perhaps the similarity is explained by transmission, Crusader contact, the Silk Road, the movement of scholars through Islamic intermediaries. Stretched, but not impossible. So let me take you further from the obvious. The Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela in Spain, completed in its Romanesque form in the 12th century, pilgrimage destination for half the Christian world. Study its plan from above, the cruciform nave, the ambulatory wrapping the apse, the proportional logic governing the relationship between transept width and nave length. Extract the master ratio. Now look at the Horyuji temple complex in Nara, Japan, 7th century by official dating, the oldest surviving wooden structures on Earth. Extract its master ratio. Now look at the Great Mosque of Cordoba, 8th century, expanded and modified across 2 centuries, one of the masterworks of medieval Islamic architecture. Extract its master ratio. The specific numbers differ across all 3. The geometric principle that generates those numbers is identical. Now move forward. The Cathedral of the Assumption in the Moscow Kremlin, 1479. The Old South Church in Boston, 1730. The Cathedral of Cordoba in Argentina, 1758. The Cathedral of St. Paul in Melbourne, begun 1880. When you measure the proportional systems governing the facade composition of each of these buildings, the ratio of the central portal width to the total facade, the tower height to the nave height, the window-to-wall ratio in the clerestory, you find a sequence of numbers that cannot be consistent across 4 buildings on 3 continents across 3 centuries with no documented architectural lineage connecting them. They are consistent to within measurement tolerances that professional surveyors consider statistically insignificant. This is what I mean by the geometry problem, not that beautiful buildings share elegant proportions, they do, but that specific, idiosyncratic, non-obvious ratios appear in structures across the entire built world in a pattern that the official history of architectural transmission cannot account for. These are not universal mathematical truths independently rediscovered. These are design decisions. Somebody made those decisions in Chartres and in Angkor and in Nara and in Melbourne. The decisions are the same decisions. The official explanation, when it arrives, is always the same. Sacred geometry. The idea, certain geometric relationships, the golden ratio, the square root of 2, the Fibonacci sequence, were understood across many cultures as reflecting divine proportion. Builders in medieval France and medieval Japan and pre-contact South America independently arrived at similar geometric systems because those systems reflect universal mathematical truths that any sufficiently sophisticated tradition eventually discovers. I've read the academic literature, I've read the primary sources, I've worked through the mathematics, and I want to be precise about where this explanation holds and where it collapses. It holds at the level of general principle. Yes, the golden ratio appears across unconnected cultures. Yes, there are mathematical relationships that multiple civilizations have found meaningful. This is real. Where it collapses is specificity. The golden ratio is a principle. The specific non-standard cornice profile that appears on the facade of a church in Samara, Russia, and on a church in Bahia, Brazil, with the same idiosyncratic proportional relationship between the projecting moulding and the frieze below it. That is not a universal truth. That is a design decision. Somebody made that decision in both places. The square root of 2 is a geometric constant. The specific clerestory fenestration pattern in the Cathedral of the Assumption in Perm, Russia, where window openings follow a 2-1-2-1 rhythm with a precise ratio of opening to pier, and that same rhythm, that same ratio, appearing in 14 other structures across 9 countries that I have personally documented through site visits and photographic surveys. That is not a constant. That is a template. Somebody had that template, and whoever held it, or whatever tradition transmitted it, distributed it across a geographical range that the official history of architectural knowledge cannot explain. This raises a simple but critical question. If sacred geometry was sufficient as an explanation, we would expect variety within the framework. Different specific expressions of the golden ratio. Different personal interpretations of the Fibonacci sequence. The fingerprints of individual architects making individual decisions within a shared mathematical language, which is what independent parallel development actually looks like. What we find instead is not variety within a framework. We find identical templates precisely repeated. The same idiosyncratic choices made in the same idiosyncratic ways in places with no documented contact. That is not independent development. That is inheritance. Something was passed down. And what was passed down was not a principle, it was a system. But the geometry problem is stranger than the distribution problem alone, because the geometry is not purely proportional. It is functional. It does something. Let me take you inside the buildings. Stand at the centre of the nave of Notre Dame in Paris on the morning of the spring equinox. At a specific moment, as the sun clears the horizon, light enters through the south transept rose window and falls at a precise angle on a specific point on the nave floor. This is not incidental. It was calculated. The building's orientation, the window placement, the pitch of the window aperture, the height of the nave, these were coordinated to produce this effect at this moment on this day. Architectural historians acknowledge it. They describe it as liturgical symbolism, as the medieval builder's expression of theological meaning through light. That may be true. But it is also astronomy, encoded in stone. Now go to Guadalajara, Mexico. The cathedral, officially begun in 1561 by Spanish colonial builders, though the evidence of what occupied that site before the Spanish arrived is handled with considerable discomfort in the official record, is oriented such that on a specific morning in early November, light enters the central doors and reaches the high altar at an angle corresponding to the sunrise on the day observed in the pre-Columbian calendar as a date of the dead. This alignment predates the Christian feast now observed at the same moment. The solar geometry corresponds to a date significant before the Spanish came. Did the Spanish builders design this intentionally, or did they construct upward from an orientation already carried in the ground? Nobody seems to have asked. I did. In the Cathedral of St. Basil in Moscow, officially constructed between 1555 and 1561, there is a geometric relationship between the positions of the 9 primary domes that an astronomer who was attempting to understand irregularities in the dome spacing first recognized in 1971. She published her finding in a Soviet architectural journal. The dome positions correspond to a specific stellar configuration visible from that latitude on a date occurring once in a multi-century astronomical cycle. The paper was cited once in subsequent literature, then never again. The silence was deafening. I found similar solar and stellar encodings in cathedrals in Cologne, in Seville, in Krakow, in Kiev, in Montreal. Not in every building, not even in most buildings, but in enough and with enough precision that the pattern cannot be dismissed as coincidence, and in each case the encoded moment corresponds to significance in systems of knowledge far older than the official founding dates of the buildings that contain it. And then there is the sound. I want to be careful here because this is where I am most at risk of reaching beyond what the evidence plainly supports. So let me restrict myself to what is published, peer-reviewed and uncontested. There is an established field called archaeoacoustics. It examines the acoustic properties of ancient and medieval structures and asks whether those properties were intentional. The research is not fringe. It appears in legitimate journals and is accepted without controversy by the researchers who work in it. What archaeoacoustics has found across structures from Neolithic Malta to Gothic France to indigenous North American ceremonial sites is that an extraordinary number of these spaces produce specific acoustic effects that are too precise and too consistent to be accidental. Standing wave resonances at specific frequencies, echo patterns occurring at geometrically exact intervals, zones of acoustic focus in floor plans that appear arbitrary until they are measured. The standing wave resonance in many of the great Gothic cathedrals, Chartres, Notre Dame, Reims, falls between 100 and 120 Hz. That frequency range has documented effects on human neurological function. Laboratory research describes those effects with careful language. Altered temporal perception, increased susceptibility to certain kinds of directed attention, states that researchers have characterized as experientially distinct from ordinary waking consciousness. The medieval builders did not have instruments to measure brainwave frequencies, but they had centuries of accumulated empirical knowledge about what happened to people inside certain rooms, what people experienced, what people became willing to believe. Was the acoustic design accidental? A byproduct of the proportional logic they were applying for visual reasons? Or was the proportional logic chosen in part because it produced specific acoustic results? Because the geometry and the sound were, in the minds of the people who built these buildings, different expressions of the same underlying system? If the geometry was chosen because it worked, not just looked beautiful, but functioned, produced measurable effects in the human nervous system, encoded astronomical information, oriented the observer in space and time in ways that served specific purposes, then we are not talking about architecture in the sense we normally use the word. We are talking about technology. This raises a simple but critical question. If these buildings were not designed only as worship spaces, if they were instruments operating on multiple levels simultaneously, what were they instruments for? Think about what a great cathedral does, taken together as a system. It orients you in space. You enter from the west, move toward the east, toward the altar, toward the light. It orients you in time. The light changes through the day and through the year, marking the calendar at moments of astronomical significance. It alters your physiological state. The acoustic properties produce neurological effects. The scale produces psychological ones. It encodes astronomical information in its orientation. It encodes mathematical information in its proportions. It contains in its decorative program a visual language of symbols shared across cultures so geographically separated that no documented channel of exchange could account for the sharing. A building that orients you in space, that orients you in time, that alters your neurological state, that encodes astronomical and mathematical knowledge, that speaks in a symbolic language crossing continental boundaries. That building is not simply a house of worship. That building is an instrument for storing and transmitting a specific kind of knowledge, not in documents, in stone, in proportion, in orientation, in sound. Documents burn, stone persists. Whatever tradition designed these buildings understood that difference, understood it at the deepest level of practical planning, and made a choice about where to put what they knew. And here is where the Tartaria hypothesis becomes impossible to avoid. I want to be careful with this word because it carries weight in two different directions. In the conventional sense, Tartaria is simply the cartographic label European mapmakers applied to the vast territories of Central and Northern Asia, the immense space between the Urals and the Pacific, between the Arctic and the Central Asian steppe. A geographic designation, a way of marking the territory they had not mapped precisely. But there is another sense in which the word is now used, a sense that the evidence has increasingly forced me to take seriously. Not Tartaria as a country, not as an empire with a capital and a flag and a dynasty, but Tartaria as a placeholder for something we do not yet have a better word for. A civilization, or a network, or a tradition, or a body of knowledge that occupied a vast territory and achieved a reach into the built environment of the entire northern hemisphere and possibly beyond that our current historical models cannot accommodate. I am not telling you Tartaria was a secret empire. I don't know that. What I know is what the buildings say. If there existed, at some point before the period we call the medieval era, a tradition with sophisticated integrated knowledge of geometry, astronomy, acoustics, and the specific intersections between those fields that produce measurable effects in human consciousness, a tradition that had developed a comprehensive technology of sacred space, then the distribution problem disappears. The identical proportional systems in Chartres and Angkor, in Santiago and Nikko, in Melbourne and Moscow. They are not the products of independent parallel developments separated by oceans. They are the products of a single body of knowledge distributed across a geography the conventional map of pre-modern civilization has never been large enough to contain. The territory labelled Tartaria is precisely the connective tissue of the Northern Hemisphere. A tradition that occupied that space would have had continuous access to every major cultural zone from Western Europe to China and through the ocean crossings of the Pacific to the Americas. Not through isolated contact, through presence, through inhabitation, through the slow accumulation of a world-spanning network that operated not by political dominance, but by the distribution of knowledge. Specifically, the knowledge of how to build spaces that did something to the people inside them. And the churches of the great Volga cities, Kazan, Samara, Yaroslavl, Nizhny Novgorod, display proportional systems and decorative programs that share more with the ecclesiastical architecture of Western Europe and the temple architecture of East Asia than the official histories of any of those traditions can easily accommodate. As if all three were drawing on a common source, as if the common source had simply been there, in the middle all along, connecting them. Then, sometime in the second half of the 19th century, it stopped. Not the buildings remained, but the knowledge encoded in them, the understanding of what they were built to do, ceased to be transmitted. The tradition that understood the geometry as functional technology, that understood the orientation as astronomical instrument, the acoustic design as a system for specific human experiences, the proportional logic as a method for storing and transmitting knowledge in stone. That tradition went silent. And what replaced it was architectural history, the practice of describing these buildings in terms of cultural context, stylistic development, patronage, and historical sequence. A practice that is not wrong exactly, but that describes the surface while systematically ignoring what is underneath. The architectural departments of the 19th century universities that formalized the study of these buildings were the same institutions that established for the official record what these buildings were. And what they established was that the buildings were expressions of faith, achievements of engineering, monuments to their periods, objects of cultural history. They were not asked, or perhaps not permitted to ask, whether the buildings were also instruments, whether the geometry did something, whether the tradition that developed the geometry understood it as a technology rather than an art. And this is where the missing documentation becomes legible in a different way. The church records that burned in provincial Russian cities. The building permits in American frontier towns that reference architects who cannot be found in any professional registry of the period. The foundation stones whose inscriptions conflict with the dates on official placards by margins of decades. These are not simply gaps in an otherwise complete record. These are the shape of a removal. Something was not merely lost, something was not replaced. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Not the buildings burned, the records, not the stone, the paper. The thing that would have explained what the stone was for was the thing that disappeared. And what took its place was a new explanation, smaller, tidier, more manageable. an explanation that described everything except the functions the buildings actually served. I go back sometimes to that archive in Florence, to the restoration documents and their careful numbers, extracted by measurement from buildings whose original design records no longer exist. The engineers who wrote those documents were precise men. They were good enough at their work to extract the proportional logic accurately, careful enough to record it faithfully. But they did not ask what the precision was for. They assumed it was craft. They assumed a great medieval builder achieved exactness because exactness was the aspiration of a great builder, because beauty is what a beautiful building is for. Maybe they were right. Maybe it was only that. But I think about the light at Chartres on the morning of the equinox. I think about the standing wave resonance in the nave of Notre Dame and what it does to the human nervous system at specific frequencies. I think about the stellar alignment in the dome positions of St. Basil's, noted in a Soviet journal, cited once and never mentioned again. I think about the proportional systems that link buildings on 3 continents without a single documented line of transmission between them, and I think about what it means that all of this is in the stone, not in any document, not in any manual or treatise or archive, in the stone, waiting to be measured, waiting for someone to ask not just how beautiful it is, but what it does. The deeper I went, the larger the silence got, and the more clearly I could see that the silence was not accidental, not simply the product of time and entropy and the ordinary losses of historical transmission. The silence has a shape. It falls precisely on the questions that would require revision of the largest things, not a detail here and there, the whole story. There is a tradition buried in the proportional logic of these buildings, a tradition that understood space and time and light and sound as a unified system. That encoded its knowledge not where it could be argued over or burned or revised, but where it would persist, in the geometry of buildings designed to outlast the civilization that built them, buildings that outlasted it, buildings that are still standing, buildings that we walk through every day without understanding what we are walking through. The geometry is still there, the ratios are still there, the alignments are still there, the acoustic properties are still there. Everything except the knowledge of what they mean is gone. I'm still reading,